Thank you so much. This is an incredible turnout and actually very intimidating. But so bear with me. It's about oh, I don't know, very early morning where I come from. So if I collapse, you'll hopefully forgive me and please be gentle. But yeah, I'm thrilled to be here because we've had some really exciting meetings so far, and I will forewarn that there are going to be some slides that you're not going to be able to read from the back. Apologies for that, but we will have them available online. And certainly the references, and if you want to find out further about any of this stuff, just please let me know. So again, thrilled to be here. We're going to touch on some things, and then maybe we can obviously take some questions, and I really want to make sure that we have enough time to have that engagement with you. So let's see. I'm hoping you'll be thinking about things as we go through. So I want to talk a little bit about the situation. And Liam's right. I mean, I've spent most of my career in public policy and evaluation, and so those two things go together to me, and I want to talk about our particular take on that. Some models and approaches, although I'm going to give that a bit of short shrift today. Can I ask how many people actually are doing the evaluation function who are here today? People who are sort of evaluators, or so it's a sort of a 50-50 breakdown, and that's good. So I'm going to not be too heavy on the evaluation jargon, but hopefully you'll be sort of familiar with some of the terms that I'll be bringing up and talking about. I mean, this is an impressive turnout for any kind of a presentation that has the word theory in the title. So I think that's, I'm amazed. I'm very, very jealous. I wish I could get this kind of turnout in Canada when I put that kind of thing up. Real world applications and what we've been trying, and hopefully some key learning. And again, you know, if you have a burning question, I mean, feel free to shout it out, I would say, and let's go from there. But I want to make sure we've got some time to discuss this. So one of the things that's irked me or bothered me a little bit about evaluation is whether we're actually doing as well as we could do when it comes to systematically understanding what's going on with whom and why, and sort of generating findings. And so I took a random walk through evaluation studies, and these are Canadian ones, that were available online, and you start to observe certain things, and these are just some of them. You know, the timeliness is critical to these stakeholders, and we've seen some natural delays outside of the control of this group, and the collaborative support has been very important, however, it hasn't always been there. And, you know, we go on to say this memorandum of understanding required data sharing, but that didn't always happen the way that we thought it would, and that, you know, seriously impeded the program. And this other program depended on volunteers, and the interviews were unanimous in attributing the decline in activity to the reduced availability of those volunteers. Overlaps, given that both the department and the beneficiary are involved in delivering similar activities, it's important to ensure that appropriate delivery model and terms and conditions are clarified for this program. It's code for we're not quite sure what we're doing between ourselves and this other group, right? These are the kind of things we're starting to see, and this was prominent. So wasn't cherry picking. These were literally the top findings in most of the evaluations I was looking at. Funding flexibility becomes another one, and I don't know if this is something that you found in your work, but the idea that, you know, the program continues to face challenges, balancing a structured planning process with the need to respond to emergency policy priorities. In other words, it's not very flexible. Funding fit in the sense of often we see short-term funding for long-term situations. And I don't know if you see a lot of that, but certainly if you're in the research world or anywhere where this needs to be a sort of a long-term investment, we've sometimes created very short-term paper chase types of things. Case studies suggest that there's need for an even stronger continuum of funding supporting collaborative research involving both X and Y researchers. And what I'm getting at there is that, again, sometimes we've got gaps in the research funding or in the funding in general. You know, and it goes on and on. Inappropriate standards for the nature of the work done, lack of clarity in the roles and responsibilities, and just basic communication issues with regard to the most common concern of both funded and non-funded recipients was the amount and quality of feedback at the early program application stage. Well, what are we finding with all of these? What do these sort of represent collectively? And again, these were the most prominent observations and findings that we found. The observation I would make is that a lot of the learning and evaluation reports relates to the way programs and initiatives are delivered. Yet most logic models, and people familiar with the logic models, yes, and use them, perhaps even do them, but many of the logic models we encounter are either silent or give short shrift to what I would call the implementation component or the action theory that goes along with the program theory. I.e., how are we describing how it is we're setting out the arrangements to deliver this program? And how well are we articulating that? And how well are we understanding the assumptions and the factors that go into that? And again, observation suggests, and look at logic models practically as a matter of course day by day, they almost never talk about that. And yet all of those observations I just gave you, arguably are part and parcel of the implementation or the action theory that goes along with the program theory. Therefore, evaluation, and probably its most significant area of learning, is actually very unsystematic and almost anecdotal in a lot of cases. So to me, this is a huge problem, and we need to think about how we can address it. So what's another manifestation of this problem? Here's an example. Now, I understand you had actually a Cash for Clunkers program in Australia. So I'm fascinated to hear about how it worked here. But I'm going to give you how it worked in North America, which is to say the United States and Canada, where I'm from. We looked at, in the late 2000s, 2008 of course specifically, the world downturn in the economy. And there was great debate about what kind of stimulus funding was appropriate for the day. Lots of debate among economists, politicians, etc., about what kind of programming would work. And if you look at it, the Cash for Clunkers program came up, and infrastructure funding came up. And what actually happened with those two types of programs in both Canada and the United States? Well, Cash for Clunkers, spent the allocated funding way ahead of schedule in both cases. In both the US and Canada, they sold out almost immediately, arguably creating the stimulus. Now you could argue, whether you believe that what's good for GM is good for America, as a past US president said. That's a debate. But at minimum, you can say it did get the money flowing in terms of doing that. It actually did probably help GM, as you may note. They were able to be bailed out by that situation, and this probably had something to do with it. The infrastructure funding, by contrast, and this I'm taking from actually not the evaluation study of it, which almost studiously ignored this component, but rather from a Globe and Mail article and an analyst that said very few meaningful stimulus-related infrastructure projects were launched in 2009. In fact, somewhat ironically, some infrastructure spending was actually delayed as provincial, state, and local governments awaited funding from the federal stimulus coffers. In other words, what ended up happening, this was a classic fix that failed. While we thought stimulus funding for infrastructure, and no offense to the economists out there, in theory, made great economic sense, in fact, there was almost no chance that it created a stimulus and probably destimulated the economy because it held up funding that should have gone in 2009. Why would this occur? And I'm kind of doing a little bit of, I don't know if it's Schadenfreude exactly, but some kind of told you so, because at the time I'd had a little blog on site and I'd said, this is not going to work. Here's why. Cash for Clunkers had a, I would argue, very simple implementation theory. Implementation and program theory. Government A suggests Cash for Clunkers incentive. Government A offers the incentive. They are aided and abetted, and as with co-delivery agents who are, after all, car salesmen. And guess what? People buy cars with this incentive and the stimulus. And of course, then whatever you can argue about economic stimulus occurs. Probably advanced car purchases that would have happened anyway, but arguably it happened at the right time. Yeah? Okay, let's consider infrastructure. You don't have to be a sort of detailed policy analyst to figure this out. You had probably government A suggest public infrastructure, province or state governments, B through M and probably more, negotiate terms, regional and municipal governments get involved and propose projects, NGOs and other interested parties present their interests, the media and the citizens weigh in, we sometimes, somehow work out governance relationships, we decide projects, the supply community needs to be appropriately engaged, and again with these large-scale projects, of course, that was not easy for procurement to do well. Governance on all the parties needs to be consistent, the procurement process goes on, the supply happens, the infrastructure projects get managed well, and then we get economic stimulus. Again, not a surprise. You could almost boil it down to a function, delays being a function of authorities times actors times size of project. Yeah, and I haven't actually done the math on that, but I think you could argue pretty persuasively that there's something to it. So what we're really saying is that the delivery model was sort of naive, or at least the lack of consideration of that was incredibly naive when it came to this as a stimulus. There are three other examples I want to give you. One is performance information is almost always inadequate for some types of programs. Yes, if you're doing evaluation, you've probably come up with this experience. And I'm going to argue that some types of programs where we're chasing people after the fact who've received funding in some way or some kind of stimulus, very difficult if we've done the thing in a rush or we've implemented it in a certain way or if we have several intermediary parties and so on. The two I want to focus on though are repayable contributions. In some areas rarely get repaid, which is what we found. And again, I'm going by Canadian experience here, but so I'll be very interested if yours is different in Australia. And the third one sounds a little esoteric, but actually relates to kind of regulatory policy writ large. The idea of administrative monetary penalties seldom work. They almost always disappoint, or at least this is what we found in Canada. We looked at sort of a dozen or so different applications. The question is, are these management problems or are these fundamental misfits of the implementation design to the requirement? And what we're getting at here then is the solution may be, and we want to jump to the solution a little bit, but we'll give the example in further detail in a moment. Don't we need to recognize the implementation, the action, the logic or theory that goes in terms of implementing along with the theory of change in a more explicit way than we've done so far? We would argue that further we would need to research what works for whom in what conditions and why for both the action theory and the change theory, or the implementation as well as the change. So it may be that we can provide information, for example, to a group. They will learn things. They will then have better capacity and they will take action. But how have we arranged for them to learn these things? What are the delivery agents? You know, what we've often found is if there's a huge agenda on the part of the delivery agents, let's say we're working with intermediary parties that may have, again, a different mission in mind, it may distort the thing and it may change. That would be a simple example, but we could go through several. We need to research and evaluate how both of these things work and then how they work with each other. Response to that or your thoughts about that. So one example is, this comes from a real case that is published, the Technology Partnerships Canada, some years old now, but the idea, the neat theory was that there's a funding gap for high-tech innovation in Canada. The mechanism was that there would be a contribution required to stimulate companies to invest in certain high-tech innovations. Part of that assumption, though, was that because the World Trade Organization had actually sanctioned Canada some years ago for undue subsidy to Bombardier, our maker of small business aircraft, that we should not be so close to commercialization that it is deemed a subsidy to the commercial production of it, i.e. there has to be some risk to the innovation. Well, therein, of course, lies some of the issues. A lot of these are going to fail, so that's a little hint. We were part of this evaluation. What I remember vividly is noting, because we looked at it back when there had been another economic downturn in the early 2000s, and suggesting that that very policy in itself was going to mean that a lot of the money was not going to be paid back. And the minister of the day had just gotten up in the House and said, oh no, it'll all be paid back. And we sort of, it's when you're thinking about, okay, you've not really thought this through or looked at the full implementation of this. Because in fact, by definition, it was not going to happen. If you had money in the stock market in these companies, you would have lost. So what makes you think you're going to get all your money back in terms of a government assistance, especially when World Trade Organization's saying it's got to be early in the process? So you see what I mean? There's some of these mechanisms that are, even with the change theory, going to be a problem. But on top of this, we work through sector associations in these high-tech sectors who purport to represent the best and the brightest and the most important innovations. And for those of you who are in the innovation business or subsidizing or supporting it, you know that that's not always true. There can be huge politics in the industry and trade associations themselves, such that people may in fact, again, delay processes or distort them in some way so it doesn't optimize. That's essentially what we found. So the theory was these three things I just mentioned, that these would need to happen. The reality observed was In fact, there was increasingly global investment in these areas, so we didn't have a gap per se in Canada. There was an overall gap in innovation, but there wasn't really a need to jump in as Canada per se. More importantly, the repayability clause was found to work against the need for nimble investment, since not only was this called Technology Partnerships Canada, but they were requiring multiple partners. Well, the moment, I don't know if we have lawyers in the room, legal training, people with, yeah, not too many, that's good. Well, I don't want to insult you, but the moment we bring a series of lawyers to the table when it comes to a funding agreement, we've almost guaranteed some delays, both in getting the agreement itself and in the wording by which we are able to make payments. This particular program was taking up to 12 to 18 months to make payments at times, simply because of the fact that it was so bizarrely worded in terms of what conditions and effects would allow payments to be made out, let alone collections to be brought back. In other words, they were able to find ways, loopholes if you like, that would not require them to repay the contribution. And again, we didn't just find this, here's the rub, we didn't just find this in the Technology Partnerships Canada. We went back in history and all of its predecessors, I won't give you the alphabet soup, but the repayable contributions in high-tech areas never got repaid to the satisfaction or to the expectation. So again, how many times are we going to keep doing the same thing and expecting different outcomes, to quote Einstein, the definition of insanity? Why aren't we looking at the implementation design and recognizing this just doesn't fit? But had we thought early on about the idea of an implementation theory being part of the equation as a key part, as opposed to just looking at the program theory that said, well, we'll provide these incentives, people will use them, and we'll have a better world sort of thing, we would have learned a lot more. Let's go to one more, and then maybe we can start talking about how we would perhaps do better. Ayres and Braithwaite may sound familiar to Australians. This being a theory in terms of the pyramid of deterrence that Mr. Braithwaite came up with some decades ago to relate to coal mining. This is also featured in a book by a person that I'm very interested in, Malcolm Sparrow, who does something called the regulatory craft and looks at how regulatory instruments work and how to manage them. But this is an Australian model, essentially, is what I'm saying. You have the idea that there needs to be a pyramid in terms of deterrence. Starts with information or a warning, moves up to a civil penalty, which is to say you've got some kind of a traffic ticket like kind of a penalty. You've got a prosecution, and then finally you've got either license suspension, revocation, or you're out of business. That's the theory. The idea is that you need this. And so you need administrative monetary penalties to fill the gap between a simple warning and prosecuting. That's the theory. You know, a civil penalty is needed to fill up the scale, and of course, agencies will readily apply AMPs to gain efficiencies in sanctioning violators, and this will improve the cost effectiveness of the whole system. That's the sort of theory that was out there. It also looked a little bit like a moneymaker to people, I think, in difficult times. I'll say that we didn't have in the AMPS report that you can read online. So this is literally the pyramid that again, Braithwaite and Ayres came up with. The question is, does it work? And the answer is, it depends. It depends on the clarity of the regulation or the clause being amped, if you like. It worked great where, you know, if you arrive at the border and you've got the sausage in the suitcase, you're not allowed to bring that in. It was very clear. It was your suitcase. I know they typically ask you if you packed it yourself, but frankly it doesn't matter because you're supposed to have absolute liability anyway. You get amped. That's the way it is. And you're at the border. You also don't get into the country if you disagree with that finding. So basically you pay the amp. Very few appeals. Works fine. On the other hand, the second place they applied it in food safety was in the animals regulation. The Animals Regulation and Animals Act, and the idea of undue suffering is a clause. So you're not allowed to have undue suffering in the transport of animals. Problem with undue suffering, it's open to wide interpretation, yeah? And of course, in Canada, we have this very extreme winters. So again, if the chickens die, or a certain proportion of them, or the cattle, or the sheep, or whatever it may be, you got to say, well, is that sort of act of God stuff? This was the weather? Was it the negligence? And if so, on whose part? Was it, you know, you've got a whole series of players whoever raised the animal, the drovers, the driver of the truck, for example, the marketplace it goes to, and ultimately the people rendering and selling the meat. So who's to blame? First of all, who do you penalize? Second of all, was this undue suffering that the animal went through, and so on. So lack of clarity big time. To go through some of the other aspects of this, the moral authority, the social legitimacy, so to speak, of this. To some people, certainly animal rights groups, it's not sufficient to do an AMP, which is an administered monetary penalty that, again, what presupposes that it's a sort of inadvertent contravention of the law. In other words, to some people, that should be prosecuted. If you've made an animal unduly suffer, you should go to jail, so to speak, or at least be prosecuted. So perhaps doesn't work that way. Nature of the sanctions, what you find is, if the sanctions are too low versus the value of the shipment, it's a cost of doing business. So the difficulty here was, what was the effective process of inspection that went on? It was very difficult to do this well with these animals being transported. So again, the final thing was nature of the offender. What we found is nobody transporting racehorses was ever getting charged with undue suffering. I mean, they're worth too much. It's cull animals, it's spent hens, it was animals for slaughter that were not of high value. So when you put those things together, what you could find is that in fact these groups, they could predict sort of 90 to 95% of not only the problematic AMPs that weren't getting paid, but also the ones that were being appealed and overturned. And interestingly, the head of compliance, the head of enforcement, 2 years after the fact, they were a little bit in denial at the front, but I met him 2 years later at a meeting. He said that was the best recommendation we ever had, the best study we ever had, because basically we're now changing. That one group that had been amped 64 times have come full circle, where they've now been consulting with them in a different way, and they check in with us every time they transport animals. So we've been able to change behavior because they adjusted the approach to stop just doing amps in a sort of mindless way and a sort of mindlessly consistent way. So change the implementation to adjust to the theory. Oh, the nature of the transactions was the other one, and sort of covered by the nature of how many people are involved and how much the transaction was worth. The thing about this is, and what the lesson from all of this is, and I could show you some very complicated logic models that try and implement or show the idea of action theory with the program change. And there are many, starting with Shen, and they go through a whole list of other ones that we could show you. They get very complicated. And then they get very simple for some people, where they just sort of add implementation theory and tack it onto the logic model. So I think you need to have a happy medium, and Einstein would say things should be made. Let's go with what we tried. And so we tried this in the area of a industrial sort of market access program. In fact, this is all published, so I can tell you what this was in terms of our forest products industry. And what we did was look at an existing logic model, which I'll show you in a minute, but it'll be illegible for those who are beyond about the first 4 rows, that's okay. Extracted the implementation theory or action theory from that model and lined it up, and then did it a different way. And we tested how do those theories work. So the original model looks something like this. The idea, I'll simply describe it, had the Ministry of the funding agency as part of the activities and outputs, and had the Industry Association as part of the activities outputs, as if they were equal. And of course the idea was that this Industry Association was going to help promote market access for forest products with funding, and that this would in turn lead to outputs, immediate outcomes, intermediate, and so on. The problem was, here's the rub. One of the things that they were promoting in particular was the fact that we treat our forests in an appropriate manner. We have a certification process for forests, of course, worldwide. The FSC is the one that's typically agreed to. We sell a lot to Europe, and Europeans were only accepting the FSC certification. Well, many of our forests are certified under different standards, CSA and a couple of others. Europeans were not accepting that. The problem is one needed to advocate to allow our product in, to allow the equivalency. The problem is this was being delegated to the Industry Association of large forest companies. How much credibility do you think they would have with European governments about the fact that there's an equivalent? Not very much. It was not in the end, when we did a case study of it, their work at all. It was in fact back channels and side channels by the Canadian government officials, and Canadian scientists and Canadian labs that were able to in fact bring people over on missions, demonstrate to them that we were treating the forest properly according to an equivalency, and get the thing done. So in fact this logic model was wrong-headed, but wrong-headed for the reason that the implementation model did not work. So I'm going to simplify it and say you've got an implementation model and a change model. Agency was funding delivery via sector, in this case a not-for-profit association, although representing some very profitable large multinational companies, and a change model that said the assistance will reach the target groups who will appropriately use the funding as incentive to change, leading to benefits to Canada. It turns out that what was really important here were key social legitimacy issues, i.e. how can these large forest product companies represent, broadly speaking, the appropriate treatment of Canadian forests, the representativeness, therefore, of them, of everybody concerned in the value chain, their experience and even capacity to do this, that most of the research they were quoting was not theirs, it was in fact Canadian research, government research, and basically it boils down to relationships and trust that was not there, not able to deliver the program. The interesting thing is by lining up that kind of thought process, and again, by recognizing that there was these series of implementation or action that went along with theories of change, we were able to sort of say, okay, and it isn't just true here, but look at elsewhere where that's been a problem. So we want to recognize the following, that theories of change, which is to say the typical thing you see in the logic model, have a lot of common characteristics. And things like Kirkpatrick for education, many of you would be familiar with that, the idea that people are engaged, they have a satisfaction level, they build capacity, they take action, and there's an impact. I'm very keen on a Claude Bennett model. This is like McDonald, and we talk about this in terms of, he's a rural sociologist, but we've used it in a lot of other contexts, which again is a step model in terms of change. The deterrence pyramid I just talked about in regulatory reform, or regulatory initiatives. The whole broad idea of homo economist versus socio-psychological views of change, as you've probably seen in the discussion in the social science world, there's a lot of change from one to the other. Taylor and Sunstein, I understand, is quite popular in terms of their book Nudge and that kind of thing, but also the idea of Kahneman's thinking fast and slow gets in some of the idea of how the brain works and how we really respond to behavior stimulus. Of course, BehaviourWorks are the experts at this, and I think it's exactly right on. It's why I was really keen to do this trip, is to look at that kind of work. That needs to be understood. But also, what needs to be understood is the implementation strategy that will enable these to work, which is to say, things like the authorizing environment. Is it clear? Do we have kind of consistent understanding of it? Who's delivering? We can either do it singularly, multi-government, triple P partnerships, those kind of things. They all have a profound effect on whether these changes work. In other words, one affects the other. We can look at generally accepted management principles like simple governance and arrangements for that. In the case of this industry association model I mentioned, there had been no notion of an oversight a group that had actually never convened. So in fact, the one piece that was going to perhaps increase the credibility of this group in international kind of promotion never occurred. So, the simple things like, are you running a hierarchy, a matrix, a network in terms of how you run yourself, can have, again, a profound effect on how this thing is delivered. And even historical, relationships, rules, and cultures. What we've been finding in food safety, which we've been looking at lately, is if you have a history with the agency of a certain way, and they're trying to change that relationship, it takes a lot of doing, a lot of effort to be able to do it. So these are the kind of things we need to recognize when we do this. I simplify it this way. The idea that you can look at some broad contextual factors. You can look at some factors related to policy instruments, the carrots, the sticks, and the sermons, if you like. You can look at engagement and relationship factors, and management and governance factors that all represent an impact on both the design and the delivery of the thing, and on the policy instrument, on the theory of change itself. And up to now, we've not been systematic in evaluation or review or planning in terms of looking at these and how they affect these particular processes. I think there's going to be a lot that we can learn by starting to generate evidence and doing evaluation studies that sort of cumulatively build our understanding and knowledge in this area. Because again, in sort of 3 decades of practice, I now look back and I go, you know, I could explain most of this. And I did see Patricia, you stuck in the back there. One of the things that I noted particularly for the AMP study was I went and looked at what Funnell and Rogers' Purpose for Program Theory had said about certain key factors that affect regulatory instruments. And after the fact, I realized that every one of them could help explain what we were finding in terms of the results. And I went, you know, my good, why aren't we arming ourselves before the fact with these factors and conditions and then looking at them as part of the review process? And what if we could collectively and cumulatively learn about what works for whom and what conditions and why with regard to them? As Ray Pawson says, who's sort of one of the fathers of realist evaluation, you know, there are multiple programs out there. Literally as many programs, each program is sort of unique to itself, but only so many theories. And in fact, if we could start to learn from the cumulative evidence that we can build in evaluation, wouldn't it be really neat if we sort of made, if you want to call it the evaluand, the policy instrument type, the theory of change that we're looking at and the theory of implementation. I hope I'm not losing people with that discussion, but you know, for those of you in evaluation, to me this is a big aha moment. You know, it's moving it from the isolated focus on a program to the nature of it, the theory, the logic of it, and not just the program being the theory of change in terms of how people change, but how we deliver it. That, you know, this is just simply, again, and you can find this actually online, and we can give you more, but we actually codified this. So again, you'll notice that many of these are distilled from various sources that we could find, including a PhD thesis, including stuff that had gone back 40 years in terms of AMPs. This is administrative monetary penalties, the factors that affected it. We went through those and listed and lined them all up, and you can see that they link to the implementation design and the policy instrument. And very simply speaking, when you have enough of these factors that are off track, i.e. varying, you fail. It's as simple as that. The interesting bit about this is these are many factors, and I won't bother you with the details of them. But again, they had been articulated as far back as the early 70s about AMPs. And when we came up with them, and you know, because we'd done our research and we'd done the study, and we said these are the problematic things that have been shown for 40 years to not work, the people and the person, in fact, who was training on administrative monetary penalties and who'd been part of this run-up of evidence collection that had been part of the process of almost a vicious circle said, well, nobody ever told us this. Nobody had done the homework to say, well, what else has been working in this type of program? And you see, the issue is administrative monetary penalties doesn't just apply, or in terms of our view of it, we shouldn't just apply or look at it in the context of food safety and transport of animals. It applies everywhere. And when we started to see it, it applied in real estate, it applied in transportation, it applied in all manner of industrial development and so on, and environment. So the point being that now we're starting to, the world's your oyster to research how these type of things work, you see? And anyway, the last bit I want to talk to you about is, in Canada we're very keen on this idea of contribution analysis. And many of you may have heard of this, and you know, my colleague John Main is sort of famous for it, and we sort of, he's actually a neighbor of mine, which I discovered about 10 years after we moved in to where we are in Ottawa. And the long story short is you can now start to take these assumptions and factors and put them right in as factors affecting elements of the chain. And so again, because this is detailed and most people won't be able to read it, simply take my word for it that we've taken many of those factors, we've lined up the implementation theory and the program, the change theory sort of linearly, and then said, look, they affect these key areas. And what's most interesting about that, and again, the other big aha for evaluators, is that once you start seeing that you're veering off in terms of some of these factors, i.e. that there are shared goals and perspectives in this case, that the context, conditions, and legal framework allow for appropriate engagement, that there's clarity in the roles, responsibilities, and in the actually in the code itself. If you don't have this, which we see early on, we don't have a number of these components, you're going to fail, if you know what I mean. And you don't have to go and do an exhaustive 5-year study to figure this out. So we can streamline evaluation, kind of broaden the analysis to look at the nature of the way that things work. And I think we can really be evidence-based for decision makers, managers at all levels when we do that. I won't go to a table discussion. We're not in tables and we're too big to do it, but I'm hoping you might be thinking about a recent situation, program, or initiative, and that maybe some of these characteristics might have affected you, how well it went, and whether any of the factors that we've just talked about might help explain it. In either you did do or could do better in terms of that. The point being that more explicit discussion of this implementation or action theory with the change theory might help that, and we won't have time or the place to go through it. The key implications then really are that implementation activities, design and delivery matter a lot. I would contend even for so-called impact evaluation. Much of what I've talked to you about, if you're an evaluator, you said, oh, well, that's process evaluation. What I'm saying is, yes, but they're the front end of impact evaluation. And if they're not right, you don't get impact. You don't pass go. So it's important to sort of, let's get off the false dichotomy of that's process, that's impact. They're all the same. They're tied up. You need to explicitly elaborate on the theories, look at each, then how they interact with each other. And the evaluation and planning implementation or implications are that we could use a generative approach, which is do our homework, read about where this type of thing has worked and with whom and why, then look at the process and impact evaluations and do them together, maybe even do them along with review and audit, because they can help contribute to the information. Look at some common key factors and assumptions, and again, the big aha for me is that they're out there already. You can typically bring them to bear on the situation. Therefore, we're looking for stronger context, communication, and engagement emphasis. And finally, we need to make an evaluation a team sport, which I think actually came up in our discussions today, if I recall correctly. And that's where I sort of wanted to leave it. I have select references. This will be available online. I'm hoping that you may have gotten something from that, but I'm really open to taking questions now. Thank you.